want to welcome you to the Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School. And this morning, I am pleased to introduce you to Michael Scofield. He has several slides that will really introduce him, so I was told to say, here's Michael.
But not with that intonation. Do you ever try to explain this class to someone outside the zip code? Basically, we sometimes talk about pure theology, but more often we're talking about general theology, which includes doctrine. But that's called theology in the Adventist culture, which is a subset of philosophy. Today I'm going to be talking about church structure, and it's way outside of these topics. And in fact, the connection, the church structure is informed by our sense of mission, our values, our ecclesiology, and our soteriology. And our sense of the importance of salvation drives a lot of what we do in the church. But my presentation is non-biblical. I'm going to give you non-biblical knowledge, experience, and best practices. But non-biblical does not mean anti-biblical. And there are a number of people who, I was explaining this to a friend back east, and she said, "Is your presentation based on the Bible?" And we're so far from that. A little bit of my background in business. I got my MBA at UCLA. I've had a career primarily in information systems, decision support, information and data quality. I was project administrator on an $8 million business process re-engineering project at a Fortune 200 company, and I learned so much from that catastrophe. And I've lectured to maybe 400 professional audiences on the topics of enterprise architecture, data management, to organizations like the Association of Government Accountants. Now there's a charismatic bunch. And since I'm a spatial guy, I show you where I have talked. The size of the dot is proportional to the number of lectures I've given. But I've also had some experience with the church structure. When I was in the Army, I was an intern for a while at the GC, Office of Statistical Secretary. I consulted the GC on compensation and reimbursement in '76. I was a member of the Forum Task Force on Church Structure, and simultaneously the Pacific Union Conference Church Structure Committee in 1984. Also on the Audit Review Committee, learned some things there. I was chair of my local church finance committee, and I was instructed to remind you I'm a sixth generation Adventist. I'm going to be using British punctuation. I rehearsed this Tuesday night over at La Sierra, and Fritz tore me apart on my punctuation, so I'm using British punctuation. I'm assuming you all come from an Adventist heritage and experience that for you or someone you care about, the Adventism is still important, both Adventist doctrine and institutions, and the culture and experience. But we're going to primarily focus on institution today. Of course, some of these slides you've seen before, because I have to reiterate that the word church is ambiguous. It could be a set of beliefs or a denomination built on those beliefs, or the invisible community, or the visible community with membership lists, or the building we worship in, or the institutional church, and I do have an icon for that, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. The scope of this discussion, we can separate institutional and congregational, and the congregational experience includes potlucks and visitation and all kinds of things that are very personal and very direct to the members, whereas the institutional experience is higher education, hospitals, trust services, and where they intersect is the assignment of the pastor to the local congregation and the support of the local schools. So why do we create institutions? Well, we expect to have synergy, stability, survivability, meaning that the institution and its processes survive the departure of any one individual, and safety, hopefully collective wisdom. And so we want institutions to be efficient, effective, and perhaps with some economies of scale. But institutions are different in what they do from what individual Christians can do. And so institutions require a centralized management and direction. They incorporate, first of all, and I'm going to harp on this later, incompetent management hurts people. It hurts employees, students, patients, and donors. And so one of our goals is to improve the acumen of management. That hurt of people is a moral issue to my mind. I've watched people suffer because of it. So competent management is a moral imperative as far as I'm concerned. And many board members and trustees do not take their responsibilities seriously, or they are woefully unqualified to be on the board, except for their money. Several concepts of institution in the World Church. We have 132 union conferences, 633 conferences and missions, 78,000 congregations, and lots of institutions, hospitals, and such. At the conference level, in the North American division, there are 58 conference presidents. Now, I used blue, but one of these icons is not blue deliberately. Some of you will catch that. The conference president has the power over career collectively of 3,600 ministers, with an average of 61 ministers per conference president. And back in the 30s and the 40s, there was horrible abuse of power by the conference president. And I can tell stories, but that would slow down my presentation. I do want to get to the Q&A. Outside of the conference and the ministerial force, the Adventism is institutional, and there are 105,000 institutional employees around the world. Now, to put that into context, ExxonMobil only has 73,000 employees. So we're bigger than ExxonMobil. I'll stipulate a few things, and you could argue with me later if you want. Church leaders, individually and collectively, are not inerrant. That should be obvious to everyone in this room. Their decisions do not become the will of God. There are some people who believe that. God's involvement or intervention in church institutions is rare. Now, we talked, I think, in April about divine temporal activism and how much God reaches down and tweaks things in our material world. I think it's rare. Institutions occasionally do bad things, and employees in the institutions occasionally do bad things, and as far as I can tell, God does not prevent it. Right there we have a conundrum. The difference between divine and worldly. Church institutions are primarily the creation of humans, albeit usually with Christian values and goals. Therefore, I maintain that they can benefit from secular or non-biblical knowledge, experience, and best practices in accounting, finance, marketing, personnel management. That's been slow to mature. Economics, communication theory. To employ such knowledge is not a sign of lack of faith, yet I get that pushback from time to time. 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, Graham, I have a photo of him, you didn't.
I defer.
Gareth Morgan talked about the organization and different facets of the organization. He had this model, which Graham talked about a bit. Here's a more detailed rendition of the same model. But basically, different people see the organization differently. But what I found more interesting in the material that he created was this different views of the pig, which is really an acknowledgement of the various stakeholders' view of a process or an institution. A year ago I used this slide in talking about higher education because a college is surrounded by stakeholders, all of which have some expectation of what the college does, and it may not always be the same. So you have, and Adventist education is starting to recognize that prospective employers and the economic and geographic community are legitimate stakeholders. That wasn't the case 50 years ago. Excellent issue of Spectrum magazine. I hope you all got it. There was an article by George Knight that kind of details the history of how the Adventist church structure was, I won't say evolved, but it changed from time to time. George Knight, I think, has contributed a great deal to our understanding of our Adventist history. He would not be an Adventist. He did not grow up Adventist. He was converted at age 19 at a evangelistic meeting held in Eureka, California, by Ralph Larson, who is, of course, the father of our Dave Larson. So there's a connection here with George Knight. Anyway, George Knight points out that almost everything about Adventist church structure and institution is non-biblical. And right there, it's kind of a leap for some people. That Ellen White redefined what Babylon meant in the discussion of church structure, and she defined it as chaos, and so the antithesis of Babylon is order and efficiency. I think they used the word gospel order in some of their discussion. And so another thing that George points out is that innovation always occurs at the union conference level, or lower, and not the general conference. And the general conference frequently opposes the innovation until it's proven. But eventually a lot of local-based innovations in how we do church have proved their worth. Most of us who have grown up Adventist understand this structure from the general conference down to the member, and I'm depicting it vertically, but that is not necessarily a helpful model. We are all used to top-down flows of authority in the Western world, and some will question, is Adventism really a hierarchy? You have the general conference, you have divisions under the general conference, unions, local conferences under that, and then individual congregations under that. And there are some people at the GC that see this as that power, authority, and legitimacy flow downward. But if they pay attention, and this is an easy mistake to make, because most of our experiences in Western culture are hierarchical. The monarchy, the military, the Roman Catholic Church, most corporations are hierarchical, with power coming down from the top. But they have to remember that the money flows up from the bottom. And so there are some disconnects. About 2 years ago, I think, I talked about the difference between formal Adventist theology and what is really believed in the pew, which I call popular theology. It's unwritten. And there's kind of a disconnect between that. And of course, the most egregious popular doctrine is that God would rather not save you and is watching for any unconfessed sin to keep you out of heaven. Very egregious doctrine, but very commonly believed across the Adventist church. A parallel construction is the mission statement of church and its institutions, what the leaders declare to be the mission, and the real motives, the goals, objectives, and processes that go on in the institution, which drive the behavior. And I believe there's a disconnect there, and next week we will discuss why a mission statement may not match the expectations of all the stakeholders around the institution. Another parallel disconnect is what the GC wants us to believe, that they have declared authority. In fact, we were using the word authority, I think, a couple weeks ago. And I learned at UCLA in the business school that there's authority, but there's really power and influence. And power and influence may not track the same way that we think authority. So who really pulls the strings? Who really can make decisions? And so there's a disconnect right there. And if you look, for example, in fact, what I've discovered years ago was that Union Conference presidents are the most powerful position in the whole Adventist system. For, among other things, it is mostly Union Conference presidents that sit on the nominating committee at the General Conference sessions. So so there's not a neat pattern of authority. In fact, within a local conference, there are all kinds of elements involved in authority and influence moving both up and down. So it's much more complex than a simple top-down hierarchy. Another disconnect is the cultivated image of the church compared to reality, what's really happening in the institution. And we may talk about that sometime. The audience for the PR content that, and I call it the PR machine, and that's a little pejorative, but the audience includes the public outside of Adventism. It's an internal audience of church members, internal decision makers, and constituency meetings. And I kind of resent having videos or multimedia at a constituency meeting when we can't ask questions. An alternate view of, for example, a union conference is that it's a joint venture of a collection of local conferences. And when you think about it, the union conference constituency is composed not of just GC officials, but delegates from the local conferences, which in turn have been formulated by delegates of the local church. So the institutional church is not inherently evil, but it does have some unfortunate byproducts. And some of those are necessary as a bureaucracy. Institution is the collection of organized structure, assets, methods, and to achieve a commonly held goal. And again, institutions should survive the coming and going of mortal people. And specialization within the institution creates efficiencies, and there is safety in number, kind of a synergy when there is collective decision making. Yet, nearly all institutions result from a visionary entrepreneur getting the thing started. And that's what's fascinating, and therein is also a danger. Think of the voice of prophecy. Wouldn't have happened if HMS Richards didn't have a vision. Kellogg in getting his health institution. W.W. Prescott, what a guy. I'll talk about him in a little bit. John Burden. All these institutions would not have existed without a visionary individual who took risks, who makes things happen, doesn't necessarily wait for direction, and is very creative in problem solving. Now, I want to focus on W.W. Prescott because I learned long ago that this was a remarkable man. He actually graduated from Dartmouth. He started Battle Creek College, then he went to start Union College, and in 1893 he was simultaneously president of 3 different colleges, which is quite an accomplishment, which he could not have done without a reliable railroad system. He then went to be at the General Conference, but for a while he went and started Avondale and was guided it. I found, I'm having so much fun with Ancestry.com, I found his passport application in 1917. He was going to sail out of Vancouver for the Orient on the, I forget the name of the ship. It's one of the Canadian Pacific, Empress of Russia, I think it was. And of course it had to have passport pictures. Now, back then, the wife was on the husband's passport. This is Daisy, his second wife. She, and get Gil Valentine to tell you the story of how he got to, she was a caregiver for his first wife who died. Notice in 1917 he gave up the beard. So anyway, there's some great stories there. Other visionaries, Sidney Brownsberger in starting Healdsburg, E.A. Sutherland starting this institutions in the Nashville area. But not all visionaries will succeed. Some visionaries can't sell their idea and find any support. Others can't execute the idea. Great ideas, poor execution, and not all visionary ideas are good or practical. So one of the functions of the Adventist Church is to apply some critical thinking. Will this really work? Do we really want to do this? Obviously, there's tension between that. That's a whole 30-minute topic. And there's a kind of a continuum, a tension between the recklessness at one end and the cautiousness at the other. The visionaries want to go forward in faith. That's a great slogan. God will reward our efforts, brother. Don't you have faith? Triumphalism often colors their judgment and their ethics. And I've seen some really unethical things done in the name of God. The pushback is don't start construction until you have some percentage of the cost in the bank. That's prudent, but it takes longer to make decisions with collective decision making, and they'll find excuses to delay. So there's always a tension between the visionaries and the establishment. When institutions grow, most bureaucracies are not designed, they evolve. And the visionary may not always have the business experience or knowledge, particularly visionary ministers. They seem not to understand cash flow. Okay? So the evolution, particularly the growth in size of an institution, causes stress in its organizational structure. And the structure has to evolve, and this can be painful. And that complexity introduces unexpected costs. And the institution may grow beyond its optimal size, and that's a radical idea. This is a whole 1-hour topic. First time I gave a full presentation on causes of organizational complexity in Richmond, Virginia a few years ago. I've done it a few other times, but that's beyond scope for today. Voice of Prophecy, I forget when the building was built there on Chevy Chase in Glendale, their headquarters building, with their bureaucracy. I'm told that HMS wanted to back off from being a manager. He just wanted to be a preacher. So there was always a general manager of the Voice of Prophecy. The General Conference decided to consolidate all of the media ministries in North America into a special campus. There in Thousand Oaks, there were 3 large buildings. I visited it frequently because I had a number of friends in the Voice of Prophecy. That northernmost building, particularly, was the Voice of Prophecy building. Now, it was sold a number of years ago, the whole campus. It was acquired by Amgen Corporation, one of the big pharmaceuticals. And about 18 years ago, I was interviewing for a job at Amgen. And I went to the headquarters building, and then they had a shuttle that took me over to interview with a manager in this, what was the Voice of Prophecy building. And I walked in the door, and the walls are all the same, and I walked up the stairwell, and the stairwell was all the same. It's just, all the people are different. And I'm thinking, this is weird. Okay. It was quite a experience. I didn't get the job offer. That's okay. Large buildings are often the result of institutions, the Battle Creek Sanitarium. And in fact, those large buildings tend to function as icons for the institution. So now I understand we have this new North American Division headquarters building. And in Adventist thinking, and this is not unique to Adventists, an institution doesn't exist without brick and mortar. And so, or at least glass and steel. And the building becomes an icon or symbol. But there are some ministries where there is no building that we can see, and I'll talk about that in a second. Not all successful bureaucracies, however, are housed in a large, recognizable building. And here comes in C. Northcote Parkinson, a management scholar, lived most of his life in Malaya, but British trained. And he's most famous for Parkinson's Law, which is work expands to fill the time allotted to it. We've just invented a new corollary. The PowerPoint file expands to consume the disk allocated to it. One of the things he said in that wonderful book, Parkinson's Law, I think it was in the 1950s, an official wants to create subordinates, not rivals. Officials make work for each other. And this is one of the sinister natures of bureaucracies. And bureaucracies grow 5 to 10% a year without regard to the amount of work to be done. Okay? So, and in one chapter, he observed that when a new headquarters building is completed, the institution has already started its decline. Okay? He pointed out that the Pentagon wasn't finished until towards the end of World War II. And World War II was really managed, the military effort was really managed from the old temporary buildings that were there along the reflecting basin. Some of you were there and remember that. He also suggested that Versailles wasn't completed, or when it was completed, the French monarchy was already losing power. So, and then he says something very interesting. The most vibrant organizations are housed in scattered temporary spaces. And if you want to find accounts payable, you have to go down an alley and up a stairwell into an adjacent building. And I could say more about that. When I was involved in the Red Cross response to the Northridge quake, and we were constantly running back and forth around alleys there in the Wilshire district. So buildings can become icons and symbols of the institution or the entity. So these are two familiar icons. Anybody recognize? Sometimes just a door is the icon, okay? In the absence of buildings, the personality becomes the icon. And so here are three personalities from our Adventist media efforts. And we should learn a lesson from Robert Schuller and the Crystal Cathedral. Because when you base an institution on a charismatic personality, you're cruising for trouble. There's all kinds of risk with that. And in fact, when Robert Schuller Sr. stopped preaching, his son just wasn't up to the job. And the congregation dwindled, the ministry dwindled, and they eventually sold this building called the Crystal Cathedral. It was neither crystal or a cathedral. They sold it to the Catholic Archdiocese. They redecorated the inside. They kept the organ there, I see. And so we see a life cycle of an institution, that particularly when it's dependent upon a particular charismatic personality. As I said, there are all kinds of sources of bureaucratic growth and complexity. I've kind of made a study of this. The demands of external authorities are complicating our institutions, government and accrediting bodies. There are several positions at La Sierra that wouldn't exist if it weren't for the demands of either the federal government or the accrediting body. And of course, competition raises expectations of customers or potential students or patients about what services the institution provides, so that contributes to the complexity, as well as efforts to increase asset utilization. Maybe next time we'll talk about asset utilization, but all of this is a one-hour topic. In fact, these 8 sources of organizational complexity to unintended consequence and actually drive up the cost of doing business. Great fun, but not for today. As bureaucracies grow, you have the organizational infrastructure, the accounting, the payroll, the grounds, maintenance, all those things have to be done. I guess one marker of the growth of an organization is when they build a cafeteria. But nowadays we have all the technical infrastructure, the networks, the servers, and all that didn't exist 40 years ago at our colleges. So there are some problems with our church institutions, I will admit. Bad decisions made by at the top impact innocent employees in the ranks. I just heard just now about a bunch of people losing their jobs on this campus because of a reorganization. Nepotism and cronyism is rampant, particularly in Adventist institutions. I've worked in a lot of secular profit-making companies. I've never seen that much. In fact, they have policies against it, but we're not so sensitive to that. There's inertia. We've always done it that way. That's why we do it. There's fragmentation of knowledge, information, and volition. Fragmentation of institutional knowledge can be a problem. One school got sued because it forgot that a particular individual molested kids, and years later brought him on the campus. Okay, so there's a lapse in institutional memory. Hence the need for data, policies, and good documentation and good minutes. One bad apple can ruin an institution's reputation. The historical culture of Adventist administration, conferences were fiefdoms, and I heard horror stories about conference presidents with absolute power firing a minister when his wife got sick because the conference president didn't want the financial burden of caring for her. The conference committee generally reported to the president, so it was powerless. So there was a lack of accountability. Accountability is terribly important when we design and run institutions. And there was a whole bunch of secrecy about finance. And that culture persisted into the 1960s. And then lay people kind of flexed their muscles, and you see more lay people on conference committees and things like that. That's a good thing. For Adventism, transparency and accountability are still a long ways off. Now there's some transparencies. I'm very appreciative of the General Conference Archive Statistics and Research website. They have put on the web all the yearbooks, all the annual statistical reports, and a host of journals, divisional journals, the Gleaners, all that is out there. So I did a little research on my grandfather, the minister of the gospel in the Atlantic Union Conference, and through the yearbooks, I found his home address all through the years, and was able to take a picture of each of the houses that he lived in. About 10 years ago, they stopped publishing workers' home addresses. And that's probably a good thing. We're much more sensitive to issues of privacy than they were back then. So the church is kind of under a bit of a shroud in terms of transparency of important information, particularly financial. Obviously, personnel issues have to be done with a certain amount of confidentiality. But accountability and transparencies can reduce risk. Occidental College, Cal Baptist, Chapman, Point Loma, all publish their audited financial statements on their website. So with the signature of the auditors. Same thing for University of Redlands, Westmont, Pepperdine, and University of San Diego, Catholic school. But La Sierra does not publish. And in fact, I've asked several times for an audited financial statement, have been denied. Maybe it's my personality. So there's this tension between the interests of the institution and the interests of the individual employee. There's a dependency and a vulnerability up and down. And I have seen so many, this sounds derogatory, but little people that get crushed in the process of the institution. So we build hierarchies and structures with great complexity. And the larger the structure, the institution, the more likely there are to be jerks. And jerks are a problem. Okay, jerks, short-sighted, insincere, insensitive, self-absorbed, may be technically qualified. I had when I was director of data quality at Experian, one of the big three, boy, that's not, take that off my resume now. Credit bureaus are not in good light. But I had 3 managers reporting to me, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. The best manager in terms of doing the job and producing the budgets and the performance evaluations who reported to me, everybody hated him. He was a jerk, but he did his job very well. He was technically competent. Now, some will say that part of the job is being able to interact with 360, the people above you, below you, and on either side. But he was so disliked. Within the Adventist institution, the jerks are often multi-generational Adventists. And they often get the job with connections, cronyism or nepotism. And they can't be fired because they're protected. And I've been up against this a number of times. But I'm going to try to do this whole talk without naming institutions or, well, I did name a little bit, but or naming names. Some of the characteristics of a jerk: manipulative, inflated self-confidence, enjoys conflict, provokes controversy, lies boldly, conceals truth, takes credit for other people's accomplishments, blames others for their own mistakes. It's a bit going to sound like someone we know. Lazy, won't learn the complexities of the business, lacks empathy. Some more. Controlling, vengeful, toxic, seeks dirt on others. Poor listener, focuses on inconsequential trivia, needlessly hypercritical and disparaging. If you have any 6 of these characteristics, bullying, and maybe we can add something else to it. If you have any 6 of these characteristics, you can be a certified jerk. Okay? With all the, I tried to make that look official. Robert Sutton, PhD, professor of management science at Stanford, got his doctorate in organizational psychology at University of Michigan, has a whole book about jerks. I've covered up the one word in the title because we're all Christians here. But one thing that he said is companies that adopt a no-jerk policy perform better. And I believe that. But it's hard to weed them out. Jerks should not be confused with well-meaning people who are over their heads. And here is where I have learned maybe 8 years ago that if I am unhappy with some administrator in the Adventist church, I just have to remind myself, and Sylvia and I have talked about this, the pond is small. The pool of potential candidates who are willing to work for the Adventist church with all its constraints and who are qualified, that the pond is rather small. So, but even without the jerks, there are well-meaning employees over their heads. There are hyper-religious legalists who impose their rules on everyone. So we have incompetent people, lack of experience, knowledge, or basic job skills. They avoid difficult duties. Like one of the tough things you have to do is deliver bad news. One of my friends in Anaheim, he's passed away, he said, "Michael, you're not a real manager until you've fired someone." Okay, and that's sometimes necessary. Ignorant of accounting principles, cannot conform to the budget. So back to my Venn diagrams. There are jerks and there are incompetent people. And some of the incompetent people are not jerks, okay? But there is some overlap there. And the incompetence often comes from immaturity. It's painful, but I don't know, Dr. Jones, you could comment. I've seen too many young pastors right out of seminary who lack judgment and maturity and really mess up in a local congregation. And if they had come to the congregation with 20 years life experience more, they might have done a little bit better. On the other extreme are the downright criminal activities: fraud, embezzlement, molestation, and sexual harassment. We have a lot of policies now to check that, but we didn't a long time ago. These people commonly preserve and project, I should say, an image of piety, and they can be devout Orthodox Adventists. I'm acquainted with one child molester who has to live out in the desert of Arizona, but he's so devout. And long stories. Working for a jerk is a difficult situation. Employees reporting to a jerk suffer. They dare not complain. The really competent employees leave, and that's a loss to the institution. But who's above the jerk? Who is not seeing those problems? That director, vice president, whatever, may be a negligent and maybe an enabler, and that's another 30-minute topic. So nepotism and cronyism, it's obvious to a lot of employees who resent it. Boy, do I hear that around this campus. Resentment. And they're constrained from saying anything because they're afraid to lose their job. So a jerk may be a schoolmate of the president. I saw that at one institution. A relative of a major donor. A relative of a board member. Or worked with or for the superior in another place. Now I appreciate the value of networking. And I've worked for one boss at 2 different companies, and he worked very hard to get me into the second company because he had confidence in my skills. That happens a lot, but it should be a mature, fair assessment of the employee's skills, not just cronyism. So there are occasionally administrators who are both competent and have integrity, and that's a delight when you see that. So the jerk and the incompetent, they do overlap too. Other organizations do really stupid things. This is not an Adventist problem alone. There was a Barings Bank, totally destroyed the organization by the work of one rogue trader working in Singapore. Some of you remember that. Wells Fargo had a policy of cross-selling. The president had to resign and was fined. The first fine was $185 million, and 5,000 employees lost their jobs because somebody, I'm trying not to use vulgar language, but somebody up at the top messed up, okay? And then there's Enron, and there's Arthur Andersen, and WorldCom. People, innocent people at the bottom lost their jobs. This is why I say competent management is a moral imperative. It's moral when people lose jobs. So, customers are hurt and inconvenienced, and there are shareholder losses. So I keep getting back, the pond is small, and that is a conundrum. As institutions grow, this isn't based on empirical data, but you achieve economies of scale. The paperwork does go up, but the potential for abuse and corruption grows exponentially with very large institutions, and very large institutions are at greater risk. Hence, they're necessary evils. The larger they are, the more difficult to control, and the greater the risk of harm to innocent parties. And I feel very strongly about that. Competent management is a moral imperative. I'll keep driving that home. Too many trustees shirk their duties, and the pool of potential employees and administrators is wrong. It is too small, and I could be wrong. How do we mitigate the evils of large institutions? Are the solutions in designing the system, or finding better people, moral, astute, experienced? And one possible solution is deliberately and aggressively cultivating a cadre of laypersons with impeccable integrity and true business acumen to populate these boards of trustees for all these institutions? Let's look at questions.
That's okay. May I just make a procedural comment? I myself have encouraged or enabled people to move away from the presenter's questions. And I think it would be helpful if we stuck to those questions, because they are ones that the presenter carefully formulated, and I would like to see us sort of work with them and then move from there. So the first one is, how do we mitigate by good what?
By good redesign of the evils of large institutions, if indeed you think there are evils.
Well, maybe I can just make a couple of comments and let's get others involved. First of all, our institutions are small. Adventist institutions, say Loma Linda compared to UCLA. This is a small institution.
Still pretty big.
Okay. Secondly, I think the potential for evil does go up with the size of the institution, but so does the possibility for good. So I think it's a two-way dynamic, not just one.
Mike, would you please define large institutions so we know what you're thinking of? Thank you.
One definition is if the president or the dean or the chancellor doesn't know the names of all the people working there and recognize them. Because when the worker bees become faceless or nameless, there's a change in the emotional dynamic there.
Always stimulating and always interesting. And I'd like to just throw in, to the first question, it's relevant to this, is that the church is always in context in the society in which it locates. In other words, in some parts of the world, the Adventist Church, with the same doctrines and the same organisational philosophy, is a sect. Mm-hmm. Because of its relative size and influence within that community. And you could think of some Eastern European countries and so on, and we are probably becoming more sectarian in some other places because we're just losing influence. In other places, the church is like a denomination, where you have to accommodate, work with, follow the laws of the land, etc., etc., etc. And then there are other places where the church becomes like the state church, where the Adventist church is so large relative to the community. Mm-hmm. That has good and bad influences as well.
Oh, enormous dangers.
Sometimes it can be a danger, and you can watch some countries, particularly in the Pacific, where the Adventist church is the largest church organisation. So while I resonate with a lot of things you're saying, it's not a question, I'm sorry, but do you see any relevance in sort of layering in that concept as well, as to just where we are and at what time we're operating?
I'm talking from North American division experience. I hear horror stories about corruption overseas, but I'm not going to try to go there today. Does that answer?
That's fine.
Okay. Ron.
On a humorous note, you might get some interesting illustrations of some of your points from Dickens' novel Little Dorrit and his description of the circumlocution office in British politics. But my point is about this last thing, I don't think you're really implying it, but there is some sort of mentality that thinks that lay persons are somehow better and pure and more competent than administrators, and in the age of social media, not only we have just as many, if not more, people who could be described, to use the medically correct term, as anal sphincters, but they have a voice that they never had before, so that you get on Facebook and all these other places all kinds of ideas that, boy, how do you sort through all this?
The web has enabled mediocrity.
There you go.
Tremendously. And just having lay people, if they're not, I had some slides. I don't remember which lecture I had, where I talk about the characteristics of a board member that we want. We want someone who's emotionally independent, who's fearless, who understands the business issues, and I shouldn't say this, but I've seen one trustee of one institution, delightful person, lady, charismatic. She showed me the binder that they gave her when she became a trustee, and she said, that doesn't interest me. So she didn't do her homework to be a competent trustee. And that doesn't do the institution any good. And so, but that still happens because major donors are often rewarded with a position on the board. And I'm not sure they always bring the kind of critical thinking that ought to be on the board. That is, you could get good decisions with a total ministerial board if you have some critical thinkers there. But I think drawing from lay people that have business experience, because we're talking business. This isn't just a church, it's a business. It's a business with noble goals, values, but it's still a business. And we have to understand the business component to it. Yes?
I went with a friend to a court as an interpreter, and I asked the question to the officer, and she got so upset of my question that she cried out, "You need to change the law." It's in regard to a redesign on your first question.
Sure.
I thought that her suggestion was so big. I mean, how in the world I'm going to change the law? It is possible, but it is very difficult. And how do we mitigate the evils? You know, I went to this church committee and I proposed to change one of our fundamental beliefs. And the church committee took my paper, but they didn't give me a chance. So I took it to the conference. The conference did the same thing. I went to the union did the same thing. I went to the division and they did the same thing. To me, to mitigate this evil, it just don't make a big deal. Let the Lord take business.
Okay, so you're gonna give the Lord the responsibility to fix all the problems, and we can just sit back and watch.
If I can fix it, what else I can do?
Well, you were acting as an individual, and maybe to make changes, good ideas have to get a critical mass of people supporting them. Okay.
I have a sneaky suspicion that your presentation was couched in light of what could potentially happen in a couple of weeks at the General Conference.
That's why Dave scheduled it for now, but I'm not thinking about the G's. I am a little, yeah.
So back to the first question. How do we kind of lessen the evils? That's strong, right? How about misguided, uninformed decisions by large institutions? And so
Yeah.
in light of what looms on the horizon in your studying and research of how large institutions go about making decisions, what advice would you give to the divisions, unions that are about to gather in a few weeks to make a very important decision?
My first advice is to the leaders who guide the discussion, not to deliberately exclude a position different than their own. Being a conference president or a union president, to me, is a thankless job because you are caught between so many conflicting interests and expectations of various stakeholders. So, but I think you're going to create more problem if a stakeholder feels that they didn't have a voice.
So very briefly, I've worked in a number of different places through my life. I worked at one, which was a secular institution with faculty governance, and I honestly couldn't figure out who called the shots or what the org chart looked like. And nowhere have I worked did it run smoother. I spent some other time in a government institution where I still have a copy of the org chart that traces me up 20-some rungs to the President of the U.S. Never worked in a more gummed up operation. My question is, from your perception, what's the role of the org chart in the functioning of a system?
Yeah, the org chart is a nominal statement. And it may indicate who can fire and hire. But the true influence, particularly in an academic institution, is much more distributed. And that's probably a good thing. Bruce Wilcox explained to me some years ago that some GC man said to David Bieber, "You don't control your faculty, that's the problem." And Bruce said, this GC guy didn't understand the academic function and structure.
Okay, I know some of you still had questions. Michael will stay by to answer those. I would like to, before we do the benediction, ask for prayer for our country. My phone went off with an alert, and U.S. bombers have approached the closest to North Korea that has happened in the 21st century. We are the furthest north of the demilitarized zone that we have been. And we've got two big people duking it out with words that may go beyond that. So hopefully it comes to naught, but I would appreciate prayers for our country. If we could do our benediction, you'll find it in front of you. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.